We'll call the meeting to order for Wicomico County Council open work session for September 26, 2017. First item on the agenda is the fiscal year 2017 and 2018 budgets.
Good morning.
Good morning. Just for the record,
I am Wayne Strasburg, Wicomico County's Director of Administration. With me is Ms. Dawn Mitchell-Parks and Mr. Paul Wilbur, County Attorney and County Finance Director. We provided Laura with background material this morning covering discussion topics for both the open session and the closed session. I'm hoping that you have those. If you haven't had the opportunity to read through them, we can pause for a couple minutes if you'd like to do that, or if you'd like me to proceed ahead, we can do that as well. At your pleasure.
we'll follow along with you, okay?
Okay.
This may require a second work session once you've had a chance to absorb it, but as far as right now,
Sure.
just go ahead and we'll
No, I
follow,
understand.
suit.
Okay, in summary, Mrs. Parks, since she took the position as Finance Director, has spent a considerable amount of time reviewing Finance Department files and work product. In doing so, she has discovered errors in both the 2017 and 2018 budgets. The administration felt that it was important to discuss these errors with council as early as possible, ergo we're here today. There are 4 significant errors that have been found. 1 in fiscal 2017 and 3 in fiscal 2018. They're detailed for you in Mrs. Parks' September 18th memorandum to me, a copy of which you've been provided. In both 2017 and 2018, bond principal and interest payments were underestimated. The 2017 underestimate can be covered by the overall county appropriation for 2017. As you know, the 2017 fiscal year has essentially been closed out. Unaudited fiscal 2017 results indicate that approximately $1.8 million will still be sent to fund balance after absorbing the necessary principal and interest payments that were not budgeted. As you've alluded to, John, we should still, however, discuss how to address the budget actual variance in our financial statements and whether or not we need to take any legislative action to cover these missteps. In 2018, we will need approximately $225,000 from contingency to cover 2 errors that we cannot absorb otherwise. Failure to budget for a Tyler Technology contract in finance. This is a significant software upgrade to the Munis system. Failure to accurately budget workers' compensation premiums. We believe we can absorb the 2018 principal and interest underestimate. May have to revisit that in the 4th quarter of the year, but we think that we can probably absorb it through other savings that we might realize during the year.
From another funding source.
Exactly.
Okay.
Basically, that being the background, I'm going to turn it over for you to ask questions or of Mrs. Park. She has the details. She is the one who has done the legwork on this. Happy to discuss it further with you.
On the workers' comp, that's for volunteer fire department, is that what it is? And it talks about, you said due to dropping station 2 and 16, it'll be $145,000. What about station 1/13? Is the county still paying for them? Would that change that?
No.
So that,
The $145,000 mark, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the $145,000 would be for the the recognized volunteer stations in the unincorporated areas.
okay. Well, removed from the budget, do the agreement, but it says, okay, so what about, you mentioned due to dropping station 2 and 16, HR estimated the cost will be 145. Because they, with new fire service agreement, I understand with the city and everything. So Station 1/13, are we also dropping coverage for them, or are we still paying, are we still covering them?
No, we're not covering them. They haven't been assigned a territory, and they're
Okay.
not an operating volunteer station in the unincorporated area.
Okay.
So this essentially was to make a long story short, estimating what our workers' compensation premiums are. You may recall that the year before, that we had had a significant premium increase as a result of some pretty bad experiences relating to several major claims. In some fashion, and I haven't been able to reconstruct this, Mark, going from 17 to 18, the funding for the volunteer fire companies got overlooked in the finance department. And it's just simply an error. We will have to pay the premiums, therefore, and I can't find a way to absorb it otherwise. So we're going to need that appropriation from contingency in order to cover those premiums. There's just simply there's no other way to cover this, unfortunately.
And how much is in contingency?
The contingency mark started at, I think, $756,000, round numbers. In total, today, we're asking for a transfer of $225,000. So that'll leave us $525,000 for the balance of the year.
Were you able to identify some of the volunteers that might be on multiple departments on different rosters?
Larry, I would really have to sift through those details with the HR department. They do a pretty good job of reviewing those roles, but I really.
So if a name came up twice, they would notice that?
I'm going to say that we would catch that, but.
Because there are some good volunteers that like helping different
Correct.
departments out.
Absolutely, yeah, correct.
I mean, these are some pretty significant errors. How did you detect them? How did you find them? Wouldn't the audit pick these up typically?
The audit would pick them up, but we picked them up before the audit picked them up. I'll let Dawn explain to you how she found these errors. And then when we go into the closed work session, I can discuss some details further with you in the closed work session.
Okay.
Our office provides a budget analysis pretty much on a weekly basis. So they first started appearing right when I first got there, as far as the debt schedule there. It showed on there as the Board of Ed having a $900,000 unfavorable variance. So that was picked up by the accounting department as they're doing their weekly work. As far as the contract for Tyler, when reviewing my own department, was finding that I was over budget, and then the analysis came into play.
Can you speak into the mic?
Okay, so the checks and balances are done on a weekly basis.
Well, let me clarify something. When Dawn came into the department, one of the things that I asked her to have the department do as quickly as possible is a weekly flash budget actual report, so that we could monitor on a weekly basis where each department stood with regard to its appropriations. And Stephen, and I forget Stephen's last name, it took a while to put that together. It's fairly complicated to put a report like that together. The 2017 report, when he put the first version of it out, we went through, everybody looked fine, except the Board of Education, and we couldn't understand how the Board of Education could be over budget. The 2018 budget, one of the issues with looking at the budget actual this early in the year is the seasonality of spending. So every department should look fine at this point in time of the year, except those who get their entire appropriation in a lump sum. The only way to delve deeper into that so that you could look at it on a week-to-week basis and have a better feel for how a department was performing would be if we budget it on a weekly basis, which we don't do. Be nice if we could, but that would be a monumental task. But you can get a sense, we're to the end of the first quarter, and you can get a sense by department as to, hey, if they've exceeded, a quarter of their budget already, we should be asking questions. So that's the purpose of the report, and that's how we found the 2017 issue, and that led to, hey, let's look at what happened in 2018.
Got it.
When you note in here that the Department 43 debt service, that's not associated with the Department 30, that's a different debt service?
We do, we separate the Board of Ed debt service with the county debt service.
Okay, so this is, okay. All right. I was
So
trying
there
to
was
look it up.
the interest for the county debt was underestimated by around 153,000.
Any particular reason for that? Just,
Normally, when you do the budget, we look at, like, we're getting ready to go to bond sale in December. We would estimate any interest payments that we may have to make before the end of the year. Now, it's very difficult to do because you're looking a year and a half away. So the budget FY '17 was actually March of '16. They didn't go to sale till fall of '16. It's difficult to estimate that. You have to by then be looking at your CIP and trying to decide how much you're going to bond sale.
okay.
So that's not unusual. Usually we do a little more of an overestimate than an underestimate for that.
Okay.
I assume the Board of Education looks at this a little bit differently than we look at it,
Board of Ed wouldn't be looking at it at all.
at all. Okay.
I mean, these are our debt payments. They're,
Right.
this is basically an allocation of principal and interest between the Board of Ed and the various county departments. So the Board of Ed wouldn't pick this up.
And they wouldn't see it.
No, they would not.
Until the financial statements come out, if they
Correct.
look to see the unfavorable variance.
Correct.
I'm glad you picked up on some of these things. I think it's very important, and it's important that we're talking about them today, so I really appreciate
Thank you.
finding these.
So the other issues mentioned in here, like the janitorial issues and things like that, that's just,
I think we can find a way to manage those, Mark. I would revisit that later in the year if we find that it's not gonna be possible, probably in the fourth quarter, but I would tell you that I think that we ought to be able to manage that.
I thought I read somewhere in here that there was a statement that said something couldn't be funded. Did I read that?
Couldn't be funded?
When I'm looking at it now, it says we'll have to take it from contingency, but I thought I read a line skimming through it this morning that one of the last lines said it couldn't be funded. Did I miss that? I could have misread it.
No, in fiscal 18, we're going to need the $145,000 from contingency
For volunteers.
for workers' comp, and we're gonna need approximately $86,000 to cover the shortfall in the Tyler Technologies contract.
About
The-
85,000, 86,000.
Yeah, $86,000. We'll try to manage through the rest of that
And then
shortfall
the
within the finance
23,000.
department, yeah.
You're gonna try to get that way?
Yeah,
Yes, I will speak with Mr. Cordry and see
Yeah,
if we can
okay.
get the interest waived.
yeah.
Okay.
I thought he had wait a minute, I missed part of that. Corby already waived interest on something, right? That's the stormwater.
Yeah, that's stormwater.
I got you. Now,
And just by way of further information, we met last week with Mayor Day, and discussed some outstanding invoices that we believe the city owes the county. So the net of it is when and if those invoices are paid, and I think they will be, netting what we owe the city out of what they owe us, we'll still be receiving some unanticipated revenue, and we'll come to council to accept that revenue.
Okay.
Now, the only good news was the peg fees, right? That was good, right?
That is good news.
So what is the total offset that needs to be
For
come from
this,
contingency?
nothing needs to come from contingency for peg fees. We
No, not for
receive,
peg fee, I mean total as far as this.
the two,
We'll get you an exact number, but John, in round numbers, it's $226,000. We'll get you an exact figure.
Okay.
You know, it's a relatively small number that we're looking at here. It's only 0.2%, I think, of this entire budget. But it is the taxpayers' money, of course, that, and I certainly do appreciate you doing the due diligence to come up with this in their behalf. It certainly is something that was necessary, I think, and it's necessary that it continues also.
What's that now, John?
Just these mistakes that have been made, that are being corrected now, that we're looking at right now. So it's a very small number compared to the total budget, but it's, it's not something we want to throw away either.
It's a small number within the context of the total budget,
Right,
but
right.
I bet there's a lot of people that disagree with you that that's a small number.
Well, of course it is. I mean,
it's
we
a
gave
small
taxes
number.
decrease.
It's a small number within context. They are errors that certainly we're not pleased with.
Right.
It's significant enough.
The other question is, how do you get the funding out of the contingency? Just take it out?
The way we always do. I'm just gonna go back to the office and write a check. No,
That scares me a little bit, but,
I mean, there is some discussion I think the 2018 errors are appropriately addressed through a transfer from contingency. 2017, we could really approach that a number of ways. My personal preference is that we should probably do a resolution acknowledging the error and approving, if you will, the disbursement of the funds. We were legally bound to make the principal and interest payments by virtue of the bond legislation. But from my personal standpoint, I think we should do a resolution acknowledging the error in the budget and acknowledging that the payments were made. It will be, we'll have to talk to PKS, but my working understanding is that the financial statements, the audited statements, will show the overage, and it'll be footnoted. Footnoting it would be helpful to have the resolution acknowledging that the county was aware of it and it has been appropriately approved by the legislative body, albeit in retrospect.
You know, Wayne, throughout the budget process, the council was pretty much criticized for our actions, the way we handled the budget. I would think that maybe in the future, before people jump up in front of the microphone and say things to discredit the council, that they made sure their own house is in order. I'm sitting here looking at this, and I'm thinking about all the things I read in the paper and seen on TV about what we were doing wrong. But looks to me like there was some problems on the other end too. So I hope in the future that maybe that'll be handled different.
Anything else?
Yes, so with the Board of Education print bond on principal and interest, that was almost $1 million difference. How does that not come up at some point in time? And I'm just curious how that comes up or doesn't come up, because that was a fiscal year 17 And I don't understand how come it's taken this long into September for us not to know that there was an overage or a shortage of almost $1 million.
We can discuss that in closed session.
Okay. Okay. That's a little bit of cash, John. Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you, appreciate it.
Thanks.
And we're going to go into the 10% procurement.
Okay.
And then we'll go back to closed.
Sure. Thank you.
Mhm. Mr. Taylor, I'm going to let you take the lead on the 10% procurement, because I know you've done a lot of work on this.
Yeah, good morning. I mean, the
morning.
part that I've looked at, of course, is the legal part. The policy part is for the other side of the table here. You could, if you wanted to, go into closed session on this because it's legal advice that I'm giving. I don't think that's necessary and probably not even warranted since this is a matter of general public interest. I think Paul Wilbur probably agrees with me on that. I prepared a memo. It's in the briefing book. I can go through that if you want me to, line by line or case by case, but I think the short answer is because of the precedent in Maryland, and particularly some rulings by the Court of Appeals, that there's an inherent risk in doing any kind of a local preference. Probably the more important case is one that was decided about 25 years ago that involved towing companies in Baltimore County, I believe it was, where they had essentially a local preference. You could only use towing companies within that county. And even within the county, I believe there were sub-districts. That was challenged, and the Court of Appeals ruled that it was unconstitutional under the Maryland Constitution.
Were they eliminating the bid process entirely and isolating their business to only one entity as opposed to including it in a bid for everyone?
I don't know that they did it by bids. I'm not sure how the allocation was done.
Okay.
But in any event, it was struck down, and I think the principle on which it was struck down would be applicable here and essentially across the board. There are other opinions that I've found that indicate the same reasoning that I think I'm offering to you, and that is that there is this risk. Montgomery County considered local preferences a few years ago, and its county attorney made this same point, that there's precedent out there that makes this questionable. There was a recent, it's not an opinion, it's what's called an advice letter by the Maryland Attorney General on a bill that came before the General Assembly this spring. I believe that was Prince George's County, that would have established a procedure in their tax sales where there would have been an initial tax sale where the only bidders could be people who lived in the county. And I think county employees, too, were included in that. They could bid also, even if they didn't live in the county. That bill was subject to an advice letter by the Attorney General where he said he thinks it's questionable, in essence. He didn't say it was unconstitutional because they don't normally do that in the advice letters. But he pointed out there was a substantial chance that it could be found that way. So more or less the same analysis that I'm making. So I think that anything that's done along that line has a risk component to it. Now, what is that risk? Well, there's two aspects of it. Obviously, council could pass a local preference or adopt a local preference policy and extend it to someone in a particular instance, and it could be challenged. I think the greater risk is that now there are some other Maryland counties that do this. I mean, there are, I'm not saying there are none by any means. I don't know whether it's more or less than half of the counties, but it's a number. It's at least a handful or two. And one of those counties could be challenged, and it could go up on appeal, and there could be a ruling essentially striking it down. Now, if that happened, and in the meantime, before it happened, this council, this county were to extend local preferences on various matters, then essentially the precedent would already be established in the other case, And those who wanted to make an issue of it here would essentially have a free ride. They wouldn't have to go through much litigation because the precedent would already be there. So I think that that's the nature of the risk. What the Court of Appeals would do, I'm not even going to flip a coin because that's not how they decide things. But there is that risk there. I've sent my memo to Paul, and I think he generally agrees with me that there is an inherent risk in doing this.
Well, yes,
Yeah,
I
Yeah.
agree with
yeah,
the memo that,
yeah.
yeah.
the memo that Bob put together in the supporting cases, I agree with what he's come up with there, that certainly there are counties that do local preference, but we have a Court of Appeals decision, I think, that makes it legally risky to adopt a local preference.
I wasn't sure if the examples that you gave, and I know, I haven't really had a chance to formally review anything yet, but it appeared to me from your brief description that these particular policies were alienating other vendors and only allowing for local. We're not suggesting that. We're certainly leaving any type of bid process open to all vendors, but adding just one qualifier, and that's a 10% local. But it appeared to me, Bob, from what you had just described, that those particular counties were completely alienating other vendors in preference of using local vendors only.
Well, that's why I say there's an inherent risk. In other words, it's not a matter of certainty, but I will quote you from some language from the Court of Appeals. And they're talking about any kind of a preference, whether it's the kind you're speaking of or just a percentage on a bid or an RFP. And the quote is that, and this is the Court of Appeals speaking, such classifications generally do not advance a legitimate government interest, but are intended instead to confer the monopoly of a profitable business upon residents of one geographic area to the exclusion of the residents of other areas. So, I mean, that principle applies broadly across the board, regardless of what the specifics might have been in the towing case in Baltimore County. And that principle has been recognized by other people who have looked at this. As I say, there was an attorney for the Montgomery County government who more or less said the same thing. And then there's the AG's letter from this spring regarding that Prince George's County matter. So it's not like I'm speaking alone on this.
I understand.
And the difficulty is that the Maryland Court of Appeals is kind of out there on this. I mean, they take a very, I don't know whether you call it liberal or expansive view on, or against, I should say, local preferences. There are other courts that have upheld local preferences.
I know that you had also suggested that we should probably reach out to other counties that do implement similar policies, and I think that is a good idea. That would be, I guess, in the hands of Mrs. Hurley, maybe through the help of Mako, to find out what counties have similar policies and see, exactly how it's played out for them.
Well, there's some. I mean, St. Mary's County had maybe not the original ordinance on this, but it's the one that Queen Anne's County essentially adopted.
Okay.
I believe there are several, at least a handful, maybe two handfuls of counties that have it. Another route would be to just simply ask the Attorney General. So, I mean, that's, if you want sort of another opinion on it, I think you're going to have a hard time getting anybody to give you a definitive opinion.
We're looking for forgiveness instead of.
Yeah, because of the Court of Appeals case.
That always works, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Do we have any idea of how many people that we do business with that reside in the county, or their businesses is owned in the county? Do we have any kind of documentation on that, or is that probably such a
would be
question?
Nick.
Such a question that we couldn't even answer that, but. Yeah, you have, I think John's had somebody contact him that's probably talking about a lot larger sum when it comes to bidding. I've had somebody contact me that's lost a couple bids over just a few dollars, I don't know if Bob and Paul could put their heads together and maybe find a way to do this that would insulate us from the legal part of it. I don't know if that's possible or not.
Well, there's a couple ways you could minimize the risk. I mean, for the Queen Anne's County ordinance, for example, applies the local preference in favor of someone who essentially has a business in that county that's owned by people in the county.
Well, that's
So it's
kinda
very,
what
it's very limited, you know,
kinda
in
what
other
we're
words,
looking
it's,
at, yeah.
whereas, for example, Staples, I mean, just to give you an example, is a business here in the county, pays taxes, employs local people, but it's certainly not locally owned. Under Queen Anne's County's ordinance, they would be adversely affected by their ordinance. It could be written differently so that it would apply the local preference only to people that don't have a place of business here and are not locally owned. That would be one way to certainly to minimize the risk. Another way to do it would be to cap it in terms of dollar amount. So it would apply, for example, to purchases, say, $2,500 or less. That would minimize the risk in two ways. It would knock down the number of potential transactions, and it would also knock down the cost-benefit ratio, if you want to look at it that way, of filing a suit, because it does cost money to do that. So there's a couple ways that risk could be minimized, but it's still there.
Well, for the benefit of the audience, the reason this came up is I had a person that owns a pretty large business in Wicomico County. It's a family-owned business, employs a lot of people, has a lot of inventory, and he lost a bid for just a few $100s to a company outside the state. And of course, his argument is, hey, we're paying all these taxes, we're employing all these people, we've been here for 50 years or 75 years, we should have some preference. And you kind of got to agree with him in a way. I understand the risk when it comes to being sued by other places. So if we could find some way to minimize that risk and still make this work would be wonderful. So. Questions?
Yeah, that's sort of it for me.
If you could maybe try to see exactly what other counties, what issues they've had, if they've had any concerns, if there's been any pushback on it, that'd be nice to know.
Okay.
Anything else from anyone? Mr. Taylor?
That's it for me.
Mr. Weber?
That's it.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it. This time we entertain a motion to close the open work to adjourn the open work session to go into closed session.
So moved.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Means adjourned.